everybody. Today you will be working on your group essays. Your essential question will be, what cultural trends had a significant impact on how Americans redefine themselves during the 20th century? Get to work. What even is a cultural trend?
Well, I looked it up, and the definition of a trend is what's hip or popular at a certain point in time. A trend simply reflects what seems to be going around at any given time. And trend can be in any area and doesn't only reflect fashion, pop culture, and entertainment.
Do you guys have any examples of a cultural trend?
I think the Harlem Renaissance is a cultural trend.
You're right.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. So how is the Harlem Renaissance a cultural trend?
So I looked it up, and it says, the Harlem Renaissance was a time where Americans went through many changes. African Americans began to express themselves through art and music. It was a time of freedom and expression, and it originated in Harlem, New York.
Okay guys, what other examples do we have here?
The women's rights movement was also an example of a cultural trend.
I just looked up the women's rights movement, and it apparently started after the early 19th century leading to the 20th century, and it was the women's struggle for equality, which they achieved in a mixed record of success. And the movement won equal opportunities in higher education and employment relatively in the 1940s and 1950s. And it was led by an activist named Betty Friedman.
I found another one too. The Roaring Twenties.
So I found that the Roaring Twenties was a decade with much social and political change. Americans thrived economically. People had a live-in-the-moment mentality, and people lived to party.
Okay, so with these examples in mind, what should our thesis be?
Ooh! Listen to this. Cultural trends such as the Roaring Twenties, the Harlem Renaissance, and the women's rights movement had a significant impact on how Americans redefined themselves during the 20th century because people let themselves loose, had their own opinion, and wanted to be equal.
That sounds like a good idea. Any thoughts, Maddie? No? Okay.
Okay, let's start with the Harlem Renaissance.
There's this part in the story where she talks about how hard it was to be an African American, and the quote states, "During this period, white people differed from color to me only in that they rode through town and never lived there. They liked to hear me speak pieces and sing and wanted to see me dance and parsing me law, and gave me generously of their small silver for doing these things, which seemed strange for me, for I wanted to do them so much that I needed bribing to stop. Only they didn't know it. The colored people gave me no dimes."
I found a quote in a scholarly article that kind of goes along with that. In the 1920s, there was little or no analysis of the work of African American artists. Fortunately, this narrow view has changed. The Harlem Renaissance is increasingly viewed through a broader lens that recognizes it as a national movement with connections to international developments in art and culture that places increasing emphasis on the non-literary aspects of the movement.
The Harlem Renaissance redefined how Americans viewed each other's contributions in the arts and in culture despite their races.
Are you going? Yes? Okay, oh no! We'll get back on this tomorrow. Alright, did anyone do any research for the women's rights movement?
Yeah, remember the story that we read in class, The Story of an Hour? When the main character's husband died, she realized that she was no longer going to be oppressed by him. And she said, "Free, body and soul, free."
So that was kind of common around the time, right? Women feeling oppressed because of men. And that's what started the women's rights movement, because women decided that they wanted to be their own individuals, and that continued throughout the 20th century, where women began entering the workforce and began being seen as their own individuals and not just tethered to a man.
I also found a scholarly article for the women's rights movement on womenhistory.org, and it states that the ratification of the 19th Amendment was in 1920, which was a major step for equality. and women still had to fight for the equal rights movement.
Oh, so the 19th Amendment made it possible for women to vote, showing that America had redefined their view of women. Specifically, it showed that Americans valued women's contributions to culture and society.
Now that we're done with the women's rights movement, I found a quote in The Great Gatsby where Nick is describing one of Gatsby's outrageous parties. He says, "By midnight the hilarity had increased. A celebrated tenor had sung in Italian and a notorious contralto had sung in jazz. And between the numbers, people were doing stunts all over the garden while happy, vacuous bursts of laughter rose toward the summer sky."
That quote perfectly summarizes the party atmosphere of the 1920s. The popular trend of that era was to live in the moment, and that's exactly what the characters of The Great Gatsby did.
In this article I found about the Roaring Twenties, it states, the traditional values were gone, and in their place came a faster, sleeker, and more daring approach to life.
This redefined American society because they became less conservative as a whole, and they seemed to move towards a looser, in-the-moment lifestyle, and they became less traditional and became more free.
Okay, so in conclusion, the Harlem Renaissance, Roaring Twenties, and women's rights movement were all cultural trends that contributed to Americans redefining themselves in the 20th century.
The Harlem Renaissance gave African Americans their own sense of culture and free thinking in the conservative era.
The women's right movement brought light to the women who wanted equality and their own voice.
And the Roaring Twenties allowed people to let themselves loose and live in the moment.
So, who was writing all that down?